Okay, good morning everybody. This is Zakai Robbins here. I am here to give you a rundown of a project I created using Rails and ReactJS. Over the past 4 days, I've been my self-teaching myself the ReactJS library for creating dynamic user interfaces. And I'm going to show you what I did, some code samples, and just explain the process that has been learning this interesting and really advanced new library. So I figure I'll start by giving you a little code demo. Alright, so here's my site. The goal of this project was to create a simple memory game where you flip cards over and try and find the matching pairs in a deck where there are two of each unique card face. So let's take a look at how this works. There's one card flipped over, and there's a second, and that was not a match. Here's another card. There we go, and that's a match. Fantastic. Now, as you could see in the first two cards I clicked, one card you click, it stays on the picture's face up, and you click a second card and the program pauses for a moment, lets you see the two cards, and then flips them back over if they're not a match. And here I've clicked two cards that are a match, and the program has paused here because it recognizes a match, but I haven't yet gotten to the point where I can deal with that, mark these two cards right here as matched, like keep them face up, and obviously I would like in the future to implement like a bit of UI that will tell a player their point tally and other pertinent information about game state. Now if we click another card here, they all flip over again. So this is the basic pattern that we have. So let's take a look at what's going on under the hood. Actually, before I get started with that, I'd like to talk a bit about my learning process over the past few days, how I approached learning a new technology, and some successes and some setbacks and things I learned from the whole process. So I chose ReactJS because I wanted more practice working with the front end of web development, and I found React to be an interesting prospect for that. I knew it would give me some practice with JavaScript, some more front-end practice, front-end styling, and it seems like it's a very valuable technology to learn these days. It's quickly gaining a lot of popularity, so it seemed like pretty relevant. I started my learning process by doing a bit of research to compile some resources. I have a big bookmarks folder, as you can see here, full of React tutorials, articles, videos. I have a couple YouTube subscriptions that I've been following. I generally like to start by getting a very high level understanding of what's going on with a new technology. I feel much more comfortable delving into technical details when I have a good grasp of the conceptual part of a new technology. So I started by watching some tutorial videos, just very simple introductions that would get me comfortable with just what React is and the philosophy behind it. And after that, I began delving into the technical documents. As we can see here, these are kind of the official documents for React. After a few tutorials, this is where I started diving in. I think that my choice of starting high level and moving my way lower and lower in terms of technical detail was a good choice. It worked very well for me and my learning style. What I wish I had done is follow the example of a couple of my cohort mates and taken a lot of notes as I was watching videos and reading the documentation for React. As you can see here, we scroll down, we'll see a lot of code examples that are sort of shown in isolation here. We can scroll down. This gives you a good sense of it. There's very little context for like what your entire program may look like given these individual code snippets. If I could go back and do this all over again, I would have been typing out everything that I saw here in the React documents down into one big file so that I could keep track better of how these documents and tutorials were progressing. And I would have had a more immediate reference to go back to and refer to as I was building my own project. I think I would have spent more time overall doing research and maybe completing a basic tutorial project before starting on my own. Unfortunately, I just started delving right into my own project and trying to incorporate these basic principles into it, and I found that as I tried to do that, because my project was unique, I ran into a lot of complex technical issues that weren't answered by tutorials or documentation, and it slowed me down a lot in terms of developing an understanding of React, because I was dealing with debugging things and trying to understand more advanced concepts just to make my own project work before I had really gotten a sense of just how the core components of React work. So those were a couple success, a setback, and a really excellent lesson learned in how to approach self-teaching in the future. So let's take a look at some code. I ran my React project inside of a Rails application. I set it up to be a client app that is delivered data through just like a client API setup. We see here I have one controller with one route, and if I had gotten to the point of saving the player's score or setting a timer for the game, other data like that, this would have been just rendering pure JSON down to the client app on the browser. So the backend and Rails portion of this project is very simple. Really, all the juicy stuff is here in the JavaScripts folder. So let's take a quick look at the single view that I have, show.html. All we have here is a single line of code, React component. root component. So this is Rails's way of rendering code from the React library. This is, one of Rails's many ways of sugaring code from other languages. Let's take a look at the documentation. Right here you can see this bit of code, react.render. You call a component here, and you with react.createElement, and you call it upon the document by an ID. This line right here on line 11 in my view is Rails's, like I said, sugaring way of rendering that core render of your very first React element. So the thing to keep in mind about React is that it's structured in a very similar way to the DOM in the classic HTML DOM. It's set up like a tree. So that's why you only see one thing on my view right here. You create a root node that corresponds to a React component, and from that all of your other branches are called, and they all kind of spit out from there and populate the DOM and provide the user with all of the visual and interactive interface that they'll experience while using your application. So you really only need one single node, and from there React will render everything else appropriately, again in a tree structure, just like you would see in your sort of classic HTML setup. In fact, let me just show you how that looks in my own project. I'll bring up the dev tools here. And one of the nifty resources I found is a special set of React dev tools. It's a Chrome extension that you can install that will show you the React version of the DOM. So here you go. It looks a lot like, check this out. Here's an HTML tree, very classic. We're all familiar with this. Everything, tabs down, and parent elements are spawning children. And it's the same structure here in React. We have a root component, and that renders a game board component, which renders a card component, which renders some HTML, or very HTML-like code, which I suppose we could get into right now. So React is structured conceptually around pieces of code that are referred to as components. Each one is a JavaScript class, and it represents an element in what the creators of React call the shadow DOM. So the intent is very much to make this as much like HTML as we can, because React was designed to sort of create an interactive DOM. I mean, HTML is really great structurally, but as we all know, you can't you can't interactively update single portions of the DOM. If you want to change one element, you have to refresh the whole entire page. And a workaround was created through jQuery. It was called Ajax. But React sort of is a new solution to that need for updating single portions of the DOM dynamically. And rather than using Ajax, which prevents the default call to refresh the whole page, and then has to make a call to the server and bring down some data, and then re-render the portion of the DOM based on the server response. What we can do React creates, again, what I called a shadow DOM, which is a very interesting concept that I'm still sort of wrapping my head around, but I think I get the higher level concepts of it. It creates a representation of the DOM, which we're seeing here, out of JavaScript components that are all transpiled into HTML elements. But this is never, these transpiled, I hope I'm using the right term there, transpiled HTML elements are never interacted with directly, because these are all being rendered by this JavaScript version, right? It's sort of like a doppelganger of the DOM structure. They're each corresponding HTML element is rendered by this piece of JavaScript code here. Let's say this card component. And since everything on the actual DOM is just a representation of this big tree of JavaScript objects that we have, when you can change a single JavaScript object, and that change will be reflected in this more static HTML code we see here. So if I change this React component card, the first child of the game board, you can see here this div class board, right, corresponds to the game board component, which we just saw. And this span right here that says React ID 00 $0, that's the corresponding HTML element for that card component. So if I make a dynamic change to the card component, it will be reflected by its corresponding HTML representation. So this allows you to do really fast and really focused destruction and re-rendering of single pieces of the DOM. So I click here, and just one JavaScript object was changed, and it was destroyed and re-rendered. That's rather than, say, in jQuery, which would just append some data, say, to the inner HTML, the JavaScript object was actually refreshed more like in the sense of a classic HTTP request, where everything is removed and then re-rendered per each request. But we only have to do that process of destruction and re-rendering for individual small pieces of our DOM. So that's sort of the high-level concept of how React works and what it conceptually looks like. So with that, I think we're ready to take a peek at my source code here. So if we go back a little ways, you'll remember that in my actual view coming from Rails, we had this sort of sugared way of saying, hey, render the root component, the root node from which all my other React elements are going to spawn. So this is the call to make that happen. This is the actual React code of that root component. So like I said, React is structured around what we call components, which you'll see here. In line 1, I have named a variable root component, and I use the react.create class method to set up a constructor and define just what that component will do, how it will behave, what properties it'll have. So this is a great example to start with because it's very basic. All we see is after declaring the class, we see on line 2 a render function. So render is a React method that actually creates that DOM representation of this component on the actual DOM. So what is it saying to do? It's saying to return the value of something called a game board, which you'll see right here. And this is an important thing to note. Game board is wrapped in what looks like a set of HTML tags. So another important element of the React library is a JavaScript syntax called JSX. If you look over here in my components folder, you'll see a lot of my files are gameboard.js.jsx. JSX is a JavaScript transpiler that allows you to use HTML syntax to declare JavaScript functions. Everything under the hood in React is really just pure JavaScript. But the guys at Facebook allowed us to use a much more visually familiar syntax through JSX that helps us declare all of that and write all of that vanilla JavaScript in a much easier to visualize and work with syntax. So that's why you'll see a lot of HTML tags. But just know, going forward, these are all actually syntactically sugared function declarations. So we see another component being rendered by, again, a render function coming from the root component is declaring another component, which is called gameboard. And we'll see here there is an optional property, I'll get into properties a little later, called pictures, and it's calling from another JavaScript page elsewhere in my project, all pictures, and a property called backImage, which is again calling from some more code that I will show you in a moment. So let's take a look at the game board. This is our game board, and again, it all starts very simply with var game board React create class. So we have another constructor that we're working with, and I will get into all of this code in a little while. But once again, just like the root component, we see a render function. And what that's calling is, what it's returning is some more JSX. We see a div is declared, two divs are declared, and these are, you see these class name. These are for CSS styling purposes. I've wrapped a the word I'm looking for. I've wrapped, it doesn't look like it, this is actually a set of components called card, and I'm generating them dynamically through JavaScript's map function. So in the card component, which is, multiple versions of these are being rendered, we'll see a number of properties being passed. It has a key, a front image, back image, a flipped property, a class name, and a click handler. So let's take a look at the card component. Again, just like in a tree structure, we went from the root component, which returned the game board, which returned a number of card components. And you can see the card component really just renders some simple HTML. It renders an image tag wrapped in a span, again for styling purposes. And you can see a click handler, class name, and a source. Obviously, it's an image tag, so all the classic things you would see in an HTML CSS image tag, except for this on-click. So when we were looking at game board, you saw a lot of these properties being passed that are calling something called card dot. this or that. And that is in the game model file. So React is just for working with the user interface. It's just for dynamic rendering of user interface. All of the logic, business logic of an application needs to be abstracted from your React code, which is something that I did not quite grasp when I started making this project. I had a lot of logic that I was trying to create using React's functionality, and it was really complex and really quite difficult to deal with. And it was later on in the process that I, with the gracious help of Stu, was able to create a model object that would take um, all of the logic for the game's state out of React and into a model in a much more appropriate classic kind of MVC framework. So we have here defined a game card in a constructor function, and there's some properties for it. There are a number of functions for it, and then we have a game model, which takes in 2 arguments. It has some properties and some prototype functions as well. And yeah, sorry about the commented stuff. Then there's quite a few functions that the game model performs. So back to our assets folder. This is where everything kind of comes from. For the user, we'll see a lot of images. The images, these are all of the comic book covers that you see when you flip a card over. They are all stored in this property here, this dot cards.